In this lecture, we will be going over how to tell your data story, how to communicate the findings of your investigation. The reading for this lecture is Mention Cording's 10 Simple Rules for Structuring Papers. If you have not read this paper, please pause, go read it, and come back. This lecture goes over 4 primary topics: effective data communication, principles of data communication, structure of data communication, and the process of putting it together. Let's start by talking about effective data communication. On the very first lecture of this course, we went over principles of data investigations, and it helps to think about these principles when going back to communicating the results of your investigation. Remember that the goals of data investigations or data science are to clearly identify what you are asking, determine the parameters and constraints of your query, know the context of your evidence, be systematic in your search, disturb the data as little as possible, see the story from as many perspectives as possible, strive for simplicity, and communicate your story effectively. Now, throughout the course, we've gone over the first 7 principles in detail, but these 7 principles really boil down to effectively communicating the story that your data has to tell. There's a mystery, you've gathered your evidence, you've evaluated the evidence, and now you need to effectively tell another what that story is. And if you can't effectively communicate your ideas and your intuition and your discoveries, then it doesn't have much value. The communication step is the single most important step of data science. So Mention Cording came up with rules for effective data communication. These are principles that are generally oriented towards writing papers, but they apply towards many other mediums of communication, including talks and posters and podcasts, etc. They present 10 rules that can be broken up into 3 categories. First, focus on one big idea. Every investigation should have just a single central idea. Present for naive, smart humans. Don't assume specialized knowledge, but go into enough detail so that intelligent but uninformed people will be able to interpret what you're saying. Rely on the context, content, conclusion, the Ccc structure. Optimize the logical flow of your argument. Now these 4 rules provide the core principles for communicating data. Next, there's the idea of the structure of your data paper. So rules on how to make your abstract a compact summary, structuring your introduction so that people understand why the study matters, structuring your results so that the conclusion is justified, or you can explain why the conclusion is justified, and using your discussion to preempt criticism, be modest and thoughtful, and give future impact. Now, these are all formal sections of a paper, but they are the general structure of any form of data science communication. You have a short summary, you have an introduction that leads into your hypotheses that are evaluated, you have the results, which are the tools that you've used to look at your data, and you have the interpretations that you pull from your data that are also taken into the broader context of the other research that's been done in this area, or the other understandings we have in these fields of research that we're working in. Finally, there are rules about or ideas about how to allocate your time wisely in this process, and effective ways of iterating through the story in order to optimize effective communication. And these two rules reflect the process of data communication itself. So we're going to dig into each one of these classes of data communication rules in the next 3 sections of this lecture. First, let's look at the rules that focus on the principles of data communication. One of the most important rules of data communication is focus your story on one single big idea. Have a single take-home message that anyone outside your field would understand. This should have more complexity than the title of, let's say, your paper or your talk, but the title should convey this key idea. You want to be specific and concise, not open-ended. So, for example, an effective way of communicating a single big idea from a study or data investigation is something like the body's inflammation response links increased poverty to reduced integrity of structural connections in the human brain. This take-home message is simple. It is spoken at a level where an intelligent but uninformed person will be able to understand a single bit of knowledge. And that's the goal for each data investigation. Have that one idea. If over the course of your investigation multiple big ideas arise, break them up into separate papers, separate talks. You really want to have your central single message be the focus of whatever it is you're trying to communicate. Think about the context of a police investigation. A law enforcement officer, let's say, investigating a robbery, that in the course of the investigation discovers another crime, charges these crimes separately. In the same way, your data is giving you evidence that you're trying to understand. And in the process of that understanding, other problems might pop up. But in the communication stage, you want each problem to be in isolation. You want it to be singular in focus. The second rule, which is to present for naive and smart audiences, really is a follow-up to that single take-home message idea. You want to assume that your audience does not have the same specialized background knowledge as you do. So for example, try to remove or reduce field-specific jargon. You can use proper terms, like the example in the last slide used inflammation. That's a very specific term, but as much as possible, you want to reduce any kind of very narrow jargon. You want to assume that your audience is rational and intelligent. Think of your audience as being capable of learning. It can be a common bit of advice that makes its way around academia is to assume that you're talking to the least intelligent person in the audience, and that's condescending in many ways. As long as your audience is capable of learning, you want to assume that what you're giving them, the bit of information you're giving them, will contribute to that learning. You also want to think about your audience as having typical human limitations. So for example, working memory limitations. Don't present a lot of items that require them to hold things in working memory in order to distill a single message. You want to assume that humans can get distractible over time. If you assume your audience is intelligent, naive, and suffers from typical human limitations, you can structure your communication in a way that effectively works with these limitations, works with these assumptions, in a way that effectively communicates a single idea. Now, one of the key structural principles for data communication is the context, content, conclusion structure, or the Ccc structure. Ccc is a pretty simple initialism to really hold on to a Structure that manifests at different levels whenever you're trying to communicate science. You hold the Ccc structure at the level of a paragraph, at the level of a figure, at the level of a paper, at the level of a talk, at the level of sections of a talk. It's this kind of fractal structure that you want to think about whenever you're working to put together ideas. So first, let's consider the context. The context is just a motivational idea, something to motivate your audience to think about the problem at hand. You want to give a little bit of background, but most importantly, you want to present why. Why is this investigation relevant? Why is it important? Why should I look at my data this way? Why should I care about this section of the previous literature in my area? Second C is content. So you want to be able to describe, elaborate, and detail the aspects of whatever it is you've just motivated. You're basically answering the how question. At the level of a paragraph, if you've introduced an idea in the paragraph about relevant limitations in prior studies, the content will be specific bits of information from those prior studies. In a paper, the content will be the methods and the results section. And finally, you want to have a conclusion. You've presented a problem. You've provided bits of information. You want to now be able to infer from that content. You want to gain insights from the information that was presented in the content section and elaboration. So if you've presented a paragraph on the limitations of the background literature and you've provided examples where the background literatures, the prior studies in this area, fail to look at a very specific thing, your conclusion is this is something that we need to look at, or this is an unresolved issue in the literature. Basically, it answers the so what question. In the level of a paper, the discussion section is your conclusion. Once you've done your study or reported your study, you've analyzed your results, you want to be able to tell your audience, so what? What does this all mean? Now, the Ccc structure is interesting because it occurs at multiple scales in data communication. It defines the structure of a paragraph, the structure of a section, the entire paper, the sections of a talk, individual slides in a talk, the overall talk. No matter what modality you're communicating your data results in, you want to think about each unit of that medium having the Ccc structure, whether it's a slide or an overall paper or an abstract for a conference. Hold tight and always ask yourself, what is the context, what is the content, and what is the conclusion? Finally, in this logic, and the Ccc logic helps in this way, you want to optimize your logical flow. You want to have almost a linear structure, and if not strictly linear, you want to have a structure with some sort of rationality to it. And that helps because that goes towards those human limitations. Humans think in sequential fashion, so it helps to really put together arguments in a coherent sequential fashion. You want to avoid zigzagging in your arguments or your interpretations. You want to present only one central idea, which goes back to the first rule of effective data communication. So the central idea should be touched on multiple times. Otherwise, just present an idea and move on. If you keep going back and forth and require your reader to think back to something that was mentioned earlier, that makes it hard for the reader to think in this sequential manner. You want to string your ideas together in a parsimonious and linear form. You want it to be simple. You want to have only the variables or only the ideas necessary for making an inference, and you want to have a linear structure to your argument. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail later in this lecture. Where possible, you use parallelism. What does that mean? Well, parallel messages should be communicated in parallel form. So, for example, if you introduce ideas, let's say in the introduction of your paper as A, then B, then C, then every time they're elaborated throughout the rest of the paper, you want to do them in the order A, then B, then C. the reason this is that if you introduced a sequence of ideas, A to B to C, it's going to be easier to anchor your reader's understanding to that specific sequence, even if this isn't the exact causal sequence necessary for understanding whatever it is you're trying to describe, but it's just the order of ideas that you present initially in either a section or your paper or your talk. Holding to that order helps your audience to anchor down to that particular sequence. So once you've addressed something with A later in your presentation, B is now inferred, so audiences look for it. That helps in this intuitive understanding of the story you're trying to communicate. Now we've gone over the basic rules of focusing on a big idea, presenting for naive but smart humans, using the Ccc structure, optimizing the logical flow. Now let's shift gears and think about the application of these principles in the formal structure of a paper. Now, I'm going over this in the structure of a scientific paper because that was how Mention Courting described it, but you can really think about this structure as being applicable to talks, to books, to podcasts, to whatever medium you're using to communicate a data science investigation. Now, in a scientific paper, the Ccc structure kind of exists in multiple forms, or exists at least in one general form for most empirical papers. So the introduction itself forms the context. The methods and the results form the content. And the discussion forms the conclusion. These are the big ideas, the big general Ccc structures to a paper. Now, this structure could also work in a talk. So, for example, a talk might have a high-level introduction. You might have 2 or 3 studies where you present content on 2 or 3 big ideas that you present the methods and the results from several studies. And then you have, at the end, a discussion that ties them all together. So think about this as being a general form of a structure of any narrative for data science communication. The abstract of a paper is a compact summary of the work, of the investigation. Now, the abstract is the single most read part of a paper, and it's often the only published text for conference posters and talks. It's also the only part of most papers that's available to the broad public. So anybody who does a PubMed search or Google Scholar search, even if the paper is behind a paywall, the abstract is freely available. So it is the single broadest distributed part of a scientific paper. So it's important that the entire paper be encapsulated here. If you think about it, if you apply the Ccc structure to the abstract, what that means is that you're going to want to start with a single motivational context setting sentence. And then you're going to want to define an open question or specifically state your hypothesis in a single sentence. So these opening sentences provide the context. Then you want to provide a few sentences that describe the methods, that gives you your content. And then you're going to want to do inferences and interpretation sentence. Something that says, we set out doing this, we found this, and we conclude X. In many cases, this is just going to be a statement of your take-home message. So you want to end your abstract with your perfectly articulated single take-home message. And in some ways, the abstract is the most important part of your paper because it tells anybody the elevator pitch of your talk or your study. So spend as much time as possible on the abstract, working the wording, working the logic. And once you actually have done that, you've distilled the essence of your study into an effective yet short, compact summary. In the introduction of your paper, you want to define why the study matters. You want to explain why the study is important and how you get to your hypotheses. So you want to focus on the big picture. Oftentimes it helps to start with a real-life anchor, a context from daily life that defines the problem for a reader. So if you're talking about visual search, let's say use an example of going to an open market and trying to identify, the apple that you want out of a large variety of apples and pears sitting in front of you. Or going to a restaurant and making a random decision on a new item of food to eat, if you're talking about decision making. Something that puts the reader in a natural, real life frame. And then you could reframe that specific problem into your theory space. So you can move it into the kind of more field-specific theoretical constructs. Once you've kind of defined your context and your problem, you want to narrow down your focus to operationalize the concepts into testable measures. If you're talking about working memory, once you've moved from defining working memory, move down into a very specific definition of what you mean for working memory, something that's testable. This limits the scope to space of variables in your hypotheses. So you want to very quickly take these operationalized definitions and move them into a space where you can then transfer to your hypothesis. So you want to end your introduction specifically laying out the specific hypotheses that you want to work with. You want to define them clearly in the space of the data that you will be working with. You can talk about this in the context of specific variables, the rationale with which you think about the relations, and most importantly, you want to define it in a way that's falsifiable. Open-ended hypotheses. We think there will be an association between childhood poverty and the structural integrity of the arcuate fasciculus. That's non-specific. You want to be very specific. We hypothesize that increased poverty, which reduces access to adequate nutritional resources and educational attainment opportunities, will result in a reduction in the white matter integrity of the arcuate fasciculus. You have a specific direction, you have a specific nature of the association, you have a justification for that. The introduction itself really should take your theory, narrow it down into that specific hypothesis, and you lay your hypothesis in a way that automatically leads the reader or your audience into understanding what you're going to be doing next, the study that you're going to describe. Next, the results are basically a description of why the conclusion that you eventually end up getting to is justified. You want to reveal the story your data is telling and point to the inferences you will make in your final conclusions. This is the drama of your data story. You've set the context, you've set the mystery. In your methods, you'll define your kind of approach to how you collected your investigation, but the results walk the reader through your logic. This is where the mystery really unfolds in an almost novel-like fashion. So start your results with a refocusing statement. Remind the reader of your hypotheses. Be specific. Recap the methods if that's necessary for the evaluation of your hypothesis. If you're working in a context where results come before the methods, you want to have a little bit of methods so that the audience can infer what was done while they're interpreting the data or the evidence that you're presenting. When presenting your results, you also want to have a specific logic sequence for every bit of information you want to provide the reader. A logic sequence is just a formal structure of starting with a question for a particular point I, moving to an answer for that question, and providing an inference for that point. So for example, if you're starting by saying that covariates of interest aren't important, or typical covariates of interest aren't important for this particular relationship you're looking at, let's say typically people regress out age and gender from these models, but you want to evaluate whether age and gender are important. That's the question. Are age and gender important as covariates for the analysis I want to get to? You would run a statistical test. You'd run a regression model. You'd also include a p-value and a Bayes factor. You maybe a AIC or BIC and say, hey, the answer to that is the statistics. The p-value and Bayes factor say that no, gender and age confounders are not important to include in the model. Therefore, my inference is that I don't need to include them in my subsequent models. That provides a single logic sequence for point I, in this case, the necessity of including these covariates in my model. Often, unless you have tight restrictions, which sometimes happens with high-profile journals or other venues, you want to include a figure for each relevant A to I transition. For every question that you set up in your text that's a meaningful question, when you go from the answer, your specific data that you look at in the specific way, and your inference from there, you want to have a figure that points to it. You want to show that, let's say, a bar plot of AIC values for models that do include covariates and those that don't. So therefore, the point I here, the logic sequence for point I, these are the big ideas that you point to. They're often presented in a paragraph in your writing form that is tied to a specific panel or full figure. And it's important to follow this logic sequence because your entire narrative in the results should be a series of sequential inferences. So you'll start with, let's say, point 1, your logic sequence 1, which is just how you cleaned your data. So what was the raw data? What did it look like? So how did I define detections next for anomalies? And what did I do for data cleansing? You can keep going down to any kind of data transformations, and you might end with your null hypothesis test statistics. So once you've talked about the distribution of the raw data, you've determined how to identify anomalies for cleaning, you've done any kind of cleaning and vetting, you've run your regression models, and now you have your p-values along with your Bayes factor that allow for you to make your big inference. These ideas are set in a logic sequence. One depends on the other. And it's important to find the most intuitive ordering of these logic sequences. And within each logic sequence, you should have this Q to A to I structure. You should start with a specific question, have some data that provides an answer, and specify the unique inference you get from that answer. And once you get to the discussion, once you've laid out all of your evidence in a sequential manner where each logic point has the Q to A to I structure, you want to conclude and contextualize your observations. And that's where the discussion comes in. You want to preempt criticism. You want to be modest and thoughtful. Think of the Adam approach from the lecture on p-values. And you want to look to the future. So often the discussion section will start with a summary statement. First paragraph will just reiterate what the hypothesis was, going back to the introduction. You'll do a brief summary of what the data showed and what the data revealed, and what's your big conclusion. What was the key inference? Does a relationship exist or not? Is poverty related to working memory performance or not? Then, in order to go towards the modesty realm, you want to specify the limitations. You want to communicate your uncertainty effectively. This was statistically significant, but the effect size is relatively low. There appeared to be a lot of confounders. What could be done better in future studies? You collected data using a particular task for assessing working memory, and that wasn't a great task. So maybe in the future you'll do another task that has more precision for the particular type of working memory you're interested in. Specify what the gaps are that you couldn't evaluate in this study. No study is perfect. There will never be a singular perfect study. So be open about where your study has its limits. It doesn't necessarily nullify your conclusions, but at least gives your reader a sense of the constraints with which they can interpret your results. You next want to articulate the relevance to the field, and you want to do this clearly. You want to specify how your findings and conclusion relate to what others have shown. You're standing on the shoulders of giants, and many, 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 many giants. You want to be able to say effectively how this study works or runs counter to what's been shown before. Acknowledge where you started from. Acknowledge where your observations sit in the context of the broader literature, even if it's a relatively novel finding. It still has a context with which it was collected in that's relevant to a broader literature, so be specific. You want to show both alignment and disagreements. There will always be both. So you want to be perfectly clear when your results run counter to what's been shown before. Not with the assumption that what you're doing is better, but just to acknowledge that in the context of studies in this area, this runs counter to that. Right? This seems to be showing an edge case for whatever it is you're trying to study, and acknowledge it. And finally, you want to end looking to the future. You want to kind of think about the extensions of your work. What new hypotheses are generated from your results? Every good study basically presents more questions than it answers. So you want to address what questions are now generated from the study that you looked at, the data that you have. What would be the next step in your series of inferences into a broader, bigger picture? Think back to the lecture on strong inference. Now that you've had this unit of observation and you're making this inference, what is the next logical step to make to ask a bigger question that goes beyond a single talk, a single paper, that gets towards these much larger, grander ideas in science? So, in the context of communicating your story, your data science story effectively, really the structure of the abstract as a short summary, introducing your ideas, communicating your results, and your discussion with these forms and structures really helps to anchor how you think about putting your story together. But all of this happens in a process. There's a physical process of putting effort into thinking about the principles and the structure of your data communication. And the process or the act of doing data communication is itself something that you want to consider. Our biggest and most valuable resource in science is time. This is our biggest constraint. So you want to think about time effectively. You want to allocate your time maybe more to the title, abstract, and figures than the rest of the paper. These are the most read. They're often the most evaluated, especially figures if you're doing complex data visualization to try to tell a very complicated story in an interesting way. People are going to spend a lot of time on the figures. Everybody's going to read the abstract, and the title needs to convey that take-home message. Take your time carefully working on these. The methods is read the least, so you want to effectively communicate your methods. That doesn't mean to spend no time on the methods, but your methods can be more formulaic. It's more of a recipe for somebody to recreate your work than it is a subtle, nuanced interpretation of hidden trends in your data. So you want to budget your effort accordingly, knowing this. You also want to iteratively outline the structure of your narrative until it has a coherent form before moving to prose. Sketch out your argument. Think about your specific logic sequences. Think about the specific Ccc structure of every paragraph, every section, the entire paper. Sketch it out, outline it. Work with different structures. See if a particular logic sequence makes sense. See if a particular sequence of inferences makes sense. Don't start writing until you've worked out that form. That will save you immense amount of time than trying to work out the logic of your paper while you're writing the prose itself. You also want to think about the value of your audience's time. You want to create a narrative arc that carries the reader's attention. And you want to think of this as being more of a story instead of a simple reporting of facts. And why that is that if you have a narrative arc, if you have a story that pulls your reader's attention through, you can minimize the need for the reader to go back and reread things. If it's telling a sequential story that has a form where audiences can predict what happens next, or what will be coming next, there's this intuition that happens as the audience is learning and hearing about your work that requires very little mental effort. And as a result, there's little effort that needs to go back or to rethink or to pause. Think about some of the favorite papers that you've ever read in science. One of the things that's probably a characteristic of those papers is that they are easy to read, even if they're going over immensely complex topics. They are very easy to read, and they read like a story. And that's important because the more time your audience have to think about the ideas in your paper, the more they have to sit and chew at a paragraph for minutes or hours on end, the less you're going to have your audience consolidate information, and the more likely you're going to have your audience just move on. And so if you want your story communicated as broadly as possible, you want to consider the efficiency of your audience's time. And finally, you want to iterate through your story. Scientific communication is an optimization problem, and you want to think of it as such. You want to write and create your story. You want to get feedback. Let's say your first draft, pass it around to lab mates. You want to evaluate that feedback that you get. Then you want to reread your original paper or your original draft in that context of that feedback. You want to write it again, and then you want to do it again. You want to then get new feedback and evaluate that feedback and reread and readjust your paper and do it again and again and again. Think of it as a search process on an error gradient. You're trying to find where your model, which is now your paper, is suboptimal, and use your feedback from your lab mates, your colleagues, your partners to optimize how you tell the story. No one writes a paper in a single sitting with no feedback. Well, I take that back. People might, but they're often not the best of papers. So good writing is a procedural process that requires this optimization. And you want to think about writing as being an iterative process that requires careful procedural attention to feedback from a broad audience. If you do that, you will smooth out these logic bumps. You will find ways in which certain bits of your logic don't work, or certain inferences don't make sense, or certain ways of plotting your results don't make sense. And you will resolve those problems before you send out the formal paper or the formal talk to audiences around the world. So don't think about scientific communication as being a one-step process. It's an iterative search process, and it requires time. Okay. In this talk, we went over mention courting's 10 rules for effective data communication. We went over the principles, focusing on a single big idea, presenting for naive, smart humans, using the Ccc structure, optimizing the logical flow. We went over the structure, going over the compact summary of the abstract, explaining why the study matters in the introduction, explaining why the conclusion is justified in the results, preempting criticism, being modest and thoughtful, and giving future impact on the discussion. And we talked a little bit about the process of putting this together, how to allocate both your time and your audience's time effectively, and how to think about the iterations of your story, thinking about writing as being an iterative search for finding the best way to communicate results. This advice is basically boiling down to the simple message of think carefully. Think carefully of the structure of your narrative. And doing so provides an effective rationality and logic for communicating your findings. You've done a lot of work visualizing, cleaning, organizing, documenting, analyzing, inferring from the data that you have. that next last step of communicating what you're finding is the single most crucial step. You want to think about having this careful structure that follows the logic and follows the rationality in order to have your knowledge be shared as broadly and as effectively as possible. If you do that, you will have done effective data science.